Imagine insulting a customer only to realize he owns the restaurant. That's exactly what happened when a rude waiter disrespected none other than Keanu Reeves. But instead of an outburst, Keanu's unexpected response left the entire room speechless. Was it revenge, wisdom, or something even deeper? This story will change the way you see true power and humility. Stay tuned, hit like, share, and subscribe because what happens next is unbelievable. The city lights of Beverly Hills shimmered against the night sky, illuminating streets lined with luxury boutiques, sleek sports cars, and the unmistakable air of exclusivity. At the center of this opulence stood Lumiere. More than just a restaurant, it was a statement, a gathering place for the elite who wanted to be seen and admired. Inside, golden chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with fine china and crystal glassware, where men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses enjoyed gourmet meals and hushed conversations. As the glass doors swung open, a man stepped inside. His presence was quiet, almost unnoticeable, yet something about him carried an air of calm confidence. He was dressed simply slightly wrinkled jeans, a basic shirt, and a jacket that showed no sign of high-end branding. He didn't wear the aura of a Hollywood star. But from the moment he crossed that threshold, he became the target of silent judgment. Behind the reception desk stood Sarah, one of Lumiere's most seasoned waitresses. Her smile was practiced, her posture poised, and her uniform impeccable. Everything about her radiated professionalism. To her, working at Lumiere was more than just a job, it was a privilege. She had spent years refining the art of hospitality, but she had also developed a dangerous habit categorizing people the moment they walked in. When she spotted the man at the entrance, her lips tightened. Something didn't fit. She scanned him, taking in the scuffed boots, the lack of designer labels, the absence of an expensive watch. Her practiced smile faltered for the briefest moment before she forced it back into place. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Her tone was polite, but laced with something sharper, an edge of skepticism. A silent "Are you lost?" lingering between her words. "I'd like a table," the man said, his voice calm, undisturbed. Sarah arched a perfectly shaped brow, as if he had just asked for something absurd. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" she asked, arms crossing over her chest. A few nearby patrons overheard and turned their heads, intrigued by the interaction. Some smirked, amused by the unfolding scene. The man, however, remained unfazed. He held her gaze with a composed expression, unaffected by her skepticism. "Yes, this is the place," he replied simply. Sarah let out a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head slightly. "All right, one moment while I check something." Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode to the reception desk, her movements exaggerated with silent condescension. Typing his name into the reservation system, she did so with an unnecessary flair, already certain of the result. No reservation. With an eye roll, she walked back to him, barely concealing her satisfaction. "As I suspected, you don't have a reservation," she announced, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We do have a few tables available, but just so you know, this isn't a casual dining spot." The man nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'd still like to dine here." Sarah let out an exaggerated sigh, snatching a menu from the podium with a dramatic flourish. "Fine," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder, "but I'll have to seat you in a more suitable area." Without waiting for a response, she turned and began leading him through the restaurant. They passed through the heart of Lumiere's grandeur, golden chandeliers, casting warm light over tables adorned with fine china and crystal glassware, where men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses enjoyed gourmet meals and hushed conversations. But she didn't stop there. Instead, she guided him to the farthest, most hidden corner of the restaurant, tucked away near the kitchen doors. The sounds of clanking dishes and muffled kitchen orders filled the air, a far cry from the refined ambience of the main dining area. Reaching the table, she dropped the menu onto it with an audible thud, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Here we go. The perfect spot for you," she said in a tone that was falsely sweet, her words heavy with veiled mockery. Sarah walked away from the table with an air of superiority, her smirk barely hidden as she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. "He won't last 5 minutes here. Bet he'll leave as soon as he opens the menu." She didn't turn back to see if Keanu heard her. She didn't care. To her, this was a game, a predictable one. She had seen men like him before. People who thought they could step into her world, into Lumiere, only to crumble under the weight of its exclusivity. Yet, As she returned to the reception area, something gnawed at her. Across the dining room, Keanu calmly opened the menu, his fingers tracing the leather-bound edges as his eyes moved over the selections with unhurried precision. The flickering candlelight on his table cast soft shadows on his face, but his posture remained relaxed, untouched by the grandeur or the quiet judgments being made around him. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance around nervously. He simply existed in the moment, as if nothing, not even Sarah's arrogance, could disturb his serenity. From the other side of the room, Sarah watched, arms crossed, her smug smile unwavering. Any minute now, she thought. He'll see the prices, his confidence will falter, and he'll quietly slip out. But the moment never came. Instead, Keanu sat there scanning the menu at his own pace, unaffected. He wasn't impressed, but more importantly, he wasn't intimidated. That irritated her more than she was willing to admit. A few minutes later, she returned, her notepad in hand. This time, there was no attempt at politeness. She didn't bother with fake warmth or even the hollow customer service routine. Instead, she flipped open her notepad with an exaggerated motion, tapping her pen impatiently against the paper. "Have you decided what you'd like?" she asked, her tone flat, barely masking her boredom. "Or would you like a recommendation?" Keanu, as composed as ever, glanced up at her before pointing to an item on the menu. "I'd like to try this one." Sarah followed his finger and nearly scoffed out loud. Filet de Rossini, a signature dish. One of the most expensive entrees on the menu. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips as she covered her mouth with her hand, feigning amusement. "Oh, of course," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A classic dish. Just to confirm, sir, you do know this costs $350, right?" Keanu nodded without hesitation. "Yes, it sounds wonderful." Sarah tilted her head, lips curling into a malicious smile. "All right then, just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want anyone to have unpleasant surprises." The words hung in the air, an open challenge. Yet Keanu's expression never wavered. His composure was impenetrable. "I'm certain." His response was simple, yet somehow it cut deeper than any retort she had been expecting. The lack of reaction, the complete indifference to her provocation had unnerved her. With an exaggerated sigh, she jotted down the order. "Very well. As you wish." She paused, then leaned in slightly. "But I'll warn you, our chef prefers dishes like this to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining. I hope it meets your expectations." Spinning on her heels, she turned to leave, but at the last second, she stopped. A wicked thought crossed her mind, and she glanced back over her shoulder. "Oh, and one more thing," she added with a smirk. "The minimum tip expected here is 20%. Keep that in mind while you enjoy." She waited for a flicker of discomfort. A subtle shift in expression. A sign that her words had landed. "Nothing." Keanu simply nodded. "Thank you for the reminder." Sarah clenched her jaw. As Keanu waited, he remained as composed as ever, glancing around the dining room, admiring the decor, the live pianist's soft melody floating through the air. He seemed genuinely at ease. The first course arrived, a carefully plated appetizer. Sarah approached his table, this time with intent. She set the plate down forcefully, causing it to slide slightly across the table, as if by accident. "Here's your appetizer," she said, her smile forced. "I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating." Keanu looked at the dish, then back at her, his slight smile unwavering. "Thank you." Sarah leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to be heard. "You know, a lot of customers who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream, but I think you'll do just fine. Good luck." Keanu held her gaze for a moment before picking up his fork. "It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention." Frustration bubbled inside her as she turned away, muttering under her breath to a coworker, "That guy won't even make it to the main course. He's going to ask for the check as soon as he sees the bill." Yet, from across the room, Keanu continued eating unbothered, unshaken, unfazed. Sarah stood at the bar, swirling the stem of an empty wine glass between her fingers, her expression smug as she glanced toward the secluded table where Keanu remained seated. She leaned toward a fellow server, lowering her voice just enough to make it seem like an offhand remark, but loud enough for the nearby staff to hear. "He's pretending to be polite, but it's obvious he's uncomfortable," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I bet he doesn't even know what he's eating." It's always the same with these types. They come here to feel important but end up making fools of themselves. The server beside her stiffened slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had heard enough of her comments for one evening. With an awkward shrug, he murmured, "Maybe he just wants to have dinner, Sarah. Maybe we should treat him like any other customer." Sarah's head snapped toward him, her brows lifting in disbelief. "Like any other customer," she echoed mockingly. She gestured toward Keanu's worn boots with a flick of her wrist. "Did you see what he's wearing? He doesn't belong here. Frankly, if he can't handle it, he shouldn't have walked through the door." Her words, laced with venom, did not go unnoticed. Across the dining room, a couple who had been discreetly watching the unfolding scene exchanged knowing glances. "She's awful," the woman whispered, shaking her head in disapproval. "He's being so polite, but she keeps trying to humiliate him." "I agree." Her companion frowned, his grip tightening around his glass. "It's disgraceful. I think we should say something to the manager." Meanwhile, Keanu continued his meal unfazed. His movements were slow, deliberate, savoring every bite. It was as if the hostility surrounding him didn't exist. As he took another sip of water, the elderly gentleman seated at the nearby table continued to observe. With a quiet nod of approval, the older man lifted his glass in a silent toast toward Keanu. Keanu, in turn, acknowledged the gesture with a subtle nod and a slight smile. The small exchange didn't go unnoticed. Sarah, watching from across the room, clenched her jaw. The idea that someone was showing respect toward him, validating him, only fueled her growing frustration. Dinner was only just beginning, but her disdain would not go unnoticed for much longer. After taking Keanu's order, Sarah made a calculated decision. She would teach him a lesson. Instead of promptly taking his order to the kitchen, she took her time, making a point to prioritize other guests she deemed more important. She stopped to chat with an elegant couple seated in the center of the dining room, laughing exaggeratedly at a joke she barely listened to. She personally delivered a cocktail to a table that wasn't even hers. All the while, Keanu sat patiently, waiting. Every time she passed his table, she pretended to be busy, eyes darting elsewhere, as if he didn't exist. When he glanced in her direction, she averted her gaze and quickened her steps, feigning urgency. Minutes turned into 20, then 30. The neglect was no longer subtle, it was deliberate. Finally, after a long and pointedly intentional wait, the elderly patron who had been observing the situation decided he had seen enough. He placed his napkin on the table and rose from his seat. With careful steps, he approached Keanu's table, a kind but firm expression on his face. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. "Good evening, young man," the older gentleman greeted, his voice warm yet commanding. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I've noticed that you've been overlooked." Keanu looked up, meeting the man's gaze with calm appreciation. "Good evening. Don't worry, it's all fine." The older man chuckled softly, leaning in slightly. Sometimes being treated like this is a test of our patience," he murmured, his tone just low enough to keep their conversation private. "But I can say with certainty that maintaining your composure is a great sign of strength." Before Keanu could respond, a sharp voice cut through the moment. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Sarah had appeared out of nowhere, her expression unreadable but her tone too polished, too forced. There was an underlying authority in her words, a veiled warning. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer." The elderly man narrowed his eyes at her, but maintained his composure. "Don't worry, miss. I was just greeting this gentleman here. It's rare to find someone so serene." Sarah let out an exaggerated sigh, her fingers tapping against the tray she held. "Well, perhaps you should return to your table and enjoy your dinner." Her words were clear dismissal. Keanu simply observed, his expression calm yet sharp. The older man gave one last glance at Sarah before turning back to Keanu. "It was a pleasure speaking with you," he said, offering a final nod before returning to his table, but not before he cast one last look of disapproval in Sarah's direction. If she noticed, she didn't show it. When Sarah finally decided to bring out Keanu's main course, she made sure to take longer than necessary. First, she stopped in the kitchen, chatting idly with the chefs, leaving the dish sitting under the warming lamp. Then she returned to the dining room, attending to another table first, ignoring the ready plate entirely. Finally, she picked up the dish and marched it over to his table, placing it down with brusque carelessness. "Here's your order. I hope you enjoy it," she said, her tone dripping with irony. "Oh, and if you don't like it, please let us know. We can always adjust to something more affordable." Keanu thanked her, his calm demeanor unchanged. "It looks excellent. Thank you." Sarah gave a cynical smile, and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. Are you sure? It's a very sophisticated dish. It might be difficult for someone who's not used to it. Keanu, once again, remained utterly unshaken. I'm sure, he replied serenely. Thank you for your concern. Sarah walked away, seething. At the bar, she turned to a coworker, laughing under her breath. Let's see if he's still smiling when the bill comes. Meanwhile, Keanu sat at his table, calmly finishing his meal. He glanced around, catching the sympathetic looks of nearby patrons. He didn't seem bothered in the slightest. As Sarah returned to clear his plate, she forced a smile, trying one last time to get a reaction out of him. So how was the dish? Did it meet your expectations? Keanu met her gaze, unwavering. It was excellent, he said simply. Please tell the chefs they did an impeccable job. Sarah's smile faltered. For the first time that evening, she felt something unsettling. Keanu wasn't leaving in shame. He wasn't flustered. And worst of all, he was still smiling. Sarah placed the coffee in front of Keanu with a sharp, deliberate motion, the porcelain cup clinking against the saucer. She could have walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she straightened, cleared her throat, and spoke just loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. It's hard to maintain standards when just anyone thinks they can walk in. She cast a pointed glance in Keanu's direction, her voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt. Her colleague, standing beside her, visibly tense, shifting uncomfortably. Sarah, maybe he began, but she cut him off before he could change the subject. That's why we have a reservations policy, she continued, flipping her hair over her shoulder as it helps us avoid situations like this. A few patrons turned toward the commotion, their murmurs rising like a low tide. Some frowned, others exchanged uneasy glances, and a handful whispered among themselves. The couple who had been quietly observing the entire evening looked outraged. The woman placed a hand on her chest, murmuring, "This is outrageous. She's trying to humiliate him in public." Across the room, the elderly gentleman who had toasted Keanu earlier took a slow sip of his wine. His expression, up until now one of patient amusement, hardened into something closer to disapproval. He muttered under his breath, "This has gone too far." Keanu, still seated, took it all in. The growing tension, the shifting mood of the room, the increasing number of watchful eyes. Yet his expression remained serene ocean, untouched by the storm brewing around him. His lack of visible reaction seemed to rattle Sarah even more, as if she needed to see him falter to win this power play she had started. 2 tables ahead, a well-dressed woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must be someone important to stay this calm. Anyone else would have left by now." Her companion, eyes locked on Keanu, nodded. Or maybe he's just stronger than she realizes. Sarah, determined to push him further, strode back to his table. This time, her smile was deliberately exaggerated, her tone mockingly sweet. "I hope you're enjoying your experience," she said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the scene she was creating. After all, it's always interesting to have different kinds of people here. It adds a unique touch to the atmosphere. This time, Keanu's gaze lifted directly to hers, steady and unblinking. A chill ran down her spine. He held her gaze for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. "Different?" He repeated the word, letting it linger between them. "Could you explain what you mean by that?" Sarah hesitated. For the first time that evening, her confidence wavered. She let out a short, nervous laugh. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way," she stammered. "It's just that, our clientele typically has a more traditional profile. It's rare to see someone with your style here." The room fell silent. Nearby diners stopped their conversations, their forks hovering midair, tuned into the exchange. Sarah, believing she had full control of the situation, basked in the attention, assuming she was winning. Keanu stayed silent, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of her words settle in the air, before he finally spoke again. "You're right," he said evenly. "Perhaps I should handle this differently." Sarah blinked, confused. Handle what differently? Before she could form a response, a new voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Reeves." The words came from across the room, filled with respect. The restaurant manager had arrived. A man in his 50s with impeccable posture and a commanding presence, the manager of Lumiere quickly surveyed the tense atmosphere. He immediately sensed something was wrong. But when his eyes landed on Keanu, his expression changed drastically. The room seemed to hold its breath. He hurried over, completely ignoring Sarah, his focus locked solely on the man seated before him. "Mr. Reeves," the manager exclaimed. his tone shifting into one of genuine deference. "I wasn't aware you were visiting us today. Please let me know how I can assist you." Sarah's face drained of color. The blood rushed from her cheeks as her mind scrambled to process what was happening. "Mr. Reeves. He knows him. What's going on here?" Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Keanu held the manager's gaze for a moment before turning his attention back to Sarah. His voice remained calm, but this time, there was an unmistakable authority beneath it. "Now," he said, "let's talk about how we treat people." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Keanu's table, the weight of the moment palpable. The manager squared his shoulders, his face carefully composed, but there was a visible tension in his stance. He ignored Sarah entirely as he addressed Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize for the delay in recognizing you. It's an honor to have you with us this evening. Please let me know how I can make your experience more enjoyable." Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she had control over had just crumbled in an instant. Keanu looked at the manager with a small, understanding smile. "Thank you, but there's no need to worry. I'm fine. I'd just like to have a brief conversation with your staff. It's not a problem." The manager's expression stiffened. He could tell that Keanu's words carried weight. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. Whatever you need." His gaze snapped to Sarah, who stood beside them, pale and visibly uncomfortable. "Sarah," he said, his tone sharp and firm. "What exactly were you thinking?" She stammered, struggling to regain some semblance of control. I didn't know. I thought." The manager cut her off, his voice low but severe. "Thought what, Sarah?" His words hit like ice. "That this customer, who happens to be one of the owners of this restaurant, didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else." Sarah's lips parted in shock. Keanu finally broke the silence, his voice calm yet commanding. "There's no need to state who I am to be treated with dignity. Frankly, it shouldn't matter. Everyone who walks through these doors, regardless of their appearance, should be welcomed with respect." The entire dining room shifted. A low murmur spread across the room as patrons whispered among themselves, stunned by the revelation. The elderly gentleman who had been watching nodded discreetly in approval. The couple who had witnessed everything exchanged pleased glances. And Sarah, she finally realized she had just made the worst mistake of her career. The tension in the dining room was palpable, as though the very air had thickened with unspoken thoughts and quiet anticipation. Every diner, every staff member, every pair of eyes in the once exclusive Lumiere restaurant was now riveted on one man. Keanu Reeves stood at his table, his expression calm yet commanding, the weight of the moment resting effortlessly upon his shoulders. The manager, still composed despite the simmering embarrassment, turned back to Sarah, his voice measured but firm. "Sarah, I expect a detailed explanation of your behavior after your shift," he said, his frustration evident but restrained. "For now, please step away from this table. I'll take over from here." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the manager's resolute gaze silenced her before she could even form a sentence. The color drained from her face as she realized there was nothing she could say to undo the damage she had done. With a sharp turn, she hurried away, avoiding the burning stares of the onlookers. Shame clung to her like a heavy weight, pressing down on her shoulders with every step she took. Keanu took a deep breath and surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had witnessed the evening unfold. Some looked guilty for having remained silent. Others appeared relieved that justice had been served. But all of them were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. And then, with a voice that carried both authority and warmth, he spoke. This restaurant was founded with the idea of being a place where everyone could feel welcome no matter how they dress or where they come from. His words resonated through the dining room, filling the silence with something more powerful than anger or wisdom. He let the words settle before continuing, his tone never wavering. "Unfortunately, that was not the case today, but I believe we can learn from this." The room remained deathly quiet, diners hanging onto every word. Even the manager, a man accustomed to dealing with high-profile clientele, seemed both uneasy and admiring of how Keanu was handling the situation. Keanu turned toward him, his demeanor calm yet commanding. "I'd like to meet with the entire team after the dining room closes. There are some important things we need to discuss." The manager nodded immediately, understanding the gravity of the request. "It will be done, Mr. Reeves. Once again, I sincerely apologize for everything." Keanu simply nodded, offering a small, knowing smile before returning to his seat. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, but the whispers continued, hushed voices marveling at what they had just witnessed. Later that night, Lumiere stood empty, its once lively dining room now filled with only its staff standing in a semicircle waiting. At the center stood Keanu Reeves, his presence commanding yet undeniably calm. He looked around, his eyes meeting each person's gaze, silently acknowledging the mixture of shame, reflection, and realization in the room. Then he spoke. "We all make mistakes," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "But what truly matters is what we do after those mistakes." The weight of his words hung in the air. "Today, we witnessed something that goes far beyond poor service. We saw the impact of snap judgments, hidden biases, and a lack of empathy." He paused, letting the truth settle. Some of the staff shifted uncomfortably, while others lowered their gazes to the floor, clearly reflecting on their own actions. Then, Keanu's gaze landed on Sarah. She sat at the back, her eyes filled with tears and shame, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Sarah," Keanu said, his tone gentle yet firm, "I know what happened today was a mistake, and mistakes can be corrected if there is effort and a willingness to learn." She lifted her head, her breath hitching slightly. "What you choose to do next will define who you are." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking deep into Sarah's chest. After a moment, she swallowed hard and whispered, I never thought about it that way before." Her voice was small, but it carried the tremor of sincerity. "I was so focused on the restaurant's image, on maintaining standards, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that every person has value, no matter who they are or what they look like." A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. "I promise, Mr. Reeves, I'll change." Keanu nodded, offering her a small, encouraging smile. "That promise is to yourself, Sarah, not to me." She blinked, surprised. "True change comes from within. And if you need help along the way, I'll be here." A mix of relief and determination washed over her face as she nodded vigorously. The rest of the staff stood in silent reflection, processing the events of the evening. Keanu took a step forward, his voice soft yet unwavering. "Kindness isn't about grand gestures." He placed his hands in his pockets, his tone becoming more reflective. "It's about the small choices we make every day. It's about treating everyone we encounter as if they matter because they do." He let those words linger. "And that is what defines the character of a place and of a person." The manager, standing in the back of the room, took a deep breath. "Mr. Reeves, your message was clear." He looked around at his staff before nodding. "We'll work to ensure that Lumiere reflects exactly what you envisioned. Thank you for reminding us of that." Keanu simply nodded, his serene smile returning. As he stepped out of the restaurant, the streets of Beverly Hills sparkled under the city lights. He paused briefly on the sidewalk, gazing at Lumiere's entrance, the glow of its chandelier still visible from within. His soft smile remained as he reflected on the evening. This night at Lumiere wasn't just about a restaurant. It wasn't just about a mistreated customer or an arrogant waitress. It was about something far greater, a truth that resonates in every corner of our lives. It was about the power of kindness, the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, and the reality that our judgments can be our greatest failures. Too often, we judge people too quickly by their clothes, their status, their appearance. We assume we know their worth before they've even spoken a word. We label, we exclude, we make snap decisions about who belongs and who doesn't. And in doing so, we not only diminish others, but we diminish ourselves. But what if we chose differently? What if instead of assumptions, we chose understanding? What if instead of exclusion, we chose acceptance? As Keanu walked down the illuminated streets of Beverly Hills, he thought not just of what had happened that night, but of the message he hoped would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. If he could leave everyone with just one thought, it would be this: in a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. Because true strength isn't in power, in arrogance, or in proving others wrong. True strength lies in kindness. It is in the ability to lift others up instead of tearing them down. It is in the courage to look beyond appearances, to see humanity before status, to treat a stranger with the same respect as a friend. And above all, it is in the small choices we make every day, the words we speak, the way we treat those who can offer us nothing in return, that shape not just the world around us, but who we are as human beings. Because in the end, no one will remember how expensive your clothes were, how elite their connections were, or how much power you held, but they will remember how you made them feel. So choose kindness every single day.